Jimmy, thank you for coming.
Sure.
There's probably only one thing that you and Donald Trump have in common, and that's that you think that journalism is broken. Can you explain why you think that's the case?
I suspect he and I have a very different view on the ways in which journalism is broken. So I would say, there's been a lot of talk in the last year about fake news. But I think that term, I think we should be careful with that term because there's a very legitimate sense of a term of fake news, which is the classic Macedonian teenagers sort of churning out spam with no regard for the truth, or maybe some propaganda mixed in there. And then there's the broader issues of the economic models of journalism and the pressure that has been placed on quality journalism, and the rise of a lot of lower quality news outlets that are making it very difficult for traditional quality journalistic organizations to survive and thrive. That is a much bigger problem, and that is an incredibly big problem when you look at the problem of local journalism. Local newspapers around the world have been really devastated by the changes. And for me, that's one of the most fundamental problems that we're facing going forward with democracy. So my hometown, Huntsville, Alabama, when I was a kid, when I was 13, I was a paper boy and, rode my bike and threw papers, very Americana thing to do. And at that time, the city had two major newspapers, the morning paper and the afternoon paper. The morning paper went out of business. The afternoon paper moved to the morning. And as of today, they only publish 3 times a week. So they're Tuesday, Thursday, Sunday. And even that understates the problem because on Tuesday, Thursday, Sunday, a lot of what they're printing is the National Newswire. So the number of local journalists working in Huntsville, Alabama, which by the way is a city of over 300,000 people, it's probably 1/10 of what it used to be. And so, I've been joking, it's a really good era to be in construction and be the brother-in-law of the mayor, because that kind of local corruption, which does so much to undermine confidence in institutions, it just becomes all that much easier. If you don't have local journalists keeping an eye on city council, keeping an eye on how contracts are being awarded, et cetera, you end up in a really bad place. And so for me, that's a big part of the problem. And that's not what we talk about a lot about fake news. It's just that quality journalism is disappearing, and that's terrible.
I agree.
All right, thank you.
And the point that you made is that the issue with fake news, Macedonian teenagers putting up things are really exploiting the economic model established by some of the big platforms, by Google, and then exploiting the virality on social media, which have given rise to clickbait, and we're all kind of used to, which you've seen some news organizations having to resort to because of the economic pressures of the internet. How was WikiTribune, has embraced a crowdfunding model. How do you think that crowdfunding can really fight this problem, and at a scale that's going to replace some of the dozens or hundreds of newspapers that you're talking about replacing?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so 2 things. So we're launching, and we actually just opened the website on beta.wikitribune.com yesterday, or day before yesterday. So we're launching with no ads and no paywalls. So I've been joking, a series of bad business decisions, but that's how I've built my career so far. And the idea is, I'm not opposed to advertising funding journalism in general. I think the ads-only model has been incredibly destructive, but if there are ways to get a diversity of income from the readers, income from some smattering of ads and things like that, that's the traditional model, and it works reasonably well. But I wanted to launch with no ads and no paywall because I wanted to focus the mind of everyone in the organization on how I want things to be different. And so in order to succeed, I need people to come and read an article and say, okay, wow, I didn't see that anywhere else. I understand the world in a way that I didn't before. This deserves to exist, and I should chip in. This is meaningful to me. And if your business model drives you in that direction rather than driving you towards viral headlines and clickbait and sort of inflammatory stuff, then hopefully produce work that's consistent with that, and that is meaningful to me.
Sure, I want to talk about the link between crowdfunding and output, because I think we've seen tremendous growth in models like Patreon, where individuals are awarded for creative work when they have a specialism, and that's been shown to work quite well. But a lot of journalism is about chasing dead ends. It's about pursuing stories that either don't get published or don't result in a story that maybe your reader is going to be happy with. And I think that one of the challenges that WikiTribune is going to face is that you're asking people to put forward money for results that we don't know what stories you're going to end up publishing, and we don't know what the results are going to look like. So how do you convince people that what you're going to be doing is fundamentally more valuable than, for example, what the New York Times is going to be doing? And how do you get them to trust in the fact that their money, they may not like what their money is buying?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a big old question. So the first piece of it is, when I was first thinking about this and talking about this with people, one of the ideas that I rejected was an idea of like a Patreon for journalism, for many reasons, just exactly like that. I think it's more important to fund a news organization than individual journalists, and thereby fund individual journalists, of course, but as part of an overall structure. In terms of how to convince people, I don't know. I mean, they seem pretty convinced that it's worth a try anyway. So we had a very successful crowdfunding, and we did that several months back, 6 months-ish ago. And we had a lot of people sign up to be monthly supporters. And of course I knew, okay, they're signing up as monthly supporters, but we're not going to start publishing until October. We'll have some drop-off as people are disillusioned or whatever, but the attrition rate has been very, very small. I've been really pleasantly surprised, and I think it's because people knew up front, okay, they're going to start working on it. I'm happy to contribute monthly to get it going, and then now that we've started publishing, I think one of the things that I'm putting out there is from day one. There's a big sort of headline story on the front page today, basically saying, this is not a news service, this is a project to build a news service, to sort of let people know, hey, we're 10 journalists, we're a small team, we're working on the software, what we really want is to grow this and to build something interesting. And of course the early work needs to be interesting. People need to look at it and say, okay, like there's early results here that are worth continuing to support.
How do you set a news agenda for what's attempting to be a global news service, that's funded by its readers and powered by the crowd? Who makes those decisions?
Yeah, so I was joking with somebody from Google X, Alphabet X, I guess it's now, because he asked the same question. I said, well, we're going to start global and scale up from there, but it's just a joke. But what I mean is obviously scale down from there, i.e. in the sense of try to get more and more local, try to get more and more detailed, local not only in geography but also in various topics and sub-communities and things like that. So we have in some ways a very traditional internal structure. So we have Peter Bale, who's our launch editor, and the journalists pitch him on story ideas and so on, and he makes those decisions. The kind of criteria we're looking at now, we're exploring. We're saying, okay, what can we do that's where do we have an advantage? Where do we have something that's unique and interesting? Where can we add value in some new way? How can we? Where are the stories that we can help our community add value as they're coming in and beginning to help us with the editing and fact checking and things like that? So it's very experimental right now, and I had considered and rejected, saying, oh, well, maybe we should start with a very narrow focus, like let's just focus on tech or one aspect of tech or the web or something like that. But I just decided, no, that would be the wrong sort of brand image from day one. The idea is we want to be universal. We want to be for everybody. We want to launch in as many languages as we can, as fast as we can. Sure. So
let's talk about objectivity. One of the things that you get taught in journalism school is that true journalistic objectivity is basically impossible for a bunch of reasons. But you've said it. You've been pretty public that you've set that as one of your goals. You've recently published the list of your kind of preferred sources. People who you think have the authority to be trusted. I noticed that Wired isn't on there, so if you can just put in a word, that'd be great. But already you're showing there some kind of implicit bias, right? Your editor-in-chief was formerly employed at CNN, which Donald Trump calls fake news. And there are going to be a lot of people who politically think that he's going to be biased as an individual. How do you grapple with objectivity in this world? And do you think that the crowd solves this problem, really?
So I think I can get very philosophical about this, and this is an area where at Wikipedia we have really very deep conversations and very deep experience in thinking about exactly that kind of question. One of the oldest things in Wikipedia, I said from the beginning that NPOV is non-negotiable. Neutral point of view is non-negotiable, that Wikipedia should be neutral. And so first of all, I don't think philosophically it doesn't make sense to me to conflate the issue of editorial judgment and bias as if they're exactly the same thing. So I think we can all understand by looking at a range of newspapers, for example, that there's such a thing as more biased and less biased. There's an attempt to say we're going to be fair, we're going to stick to the facts, we're going to listen to all relevant points of view. You want to avoid the false neutrality of, some say the moon is made of rocks, some say cheese, who knows? And we've all seen cases of this where you've got some esteemed scientist who's discussing the importance of vaccinating your children, and then you've got a sort of washed-up comedian actress who says, "Oh no, it's terrible," and it's like, well, this isn't exactly neutral, right? You're actually elevating something that is not a reason. So you can make editorial judgments, but you can make them on the basis of seriousness and factuality and so forth, and that doesn't mean you're biased. Sure. I mean, you could say in a roundabout way you're biased in favor of the truth, but to me that's nonsense. So I think it's absolutely valid to say, look, we should make editorial judgments, and we should make them in as neutral a fashion as possible. So we're not going to prejudice against any sort of legitimate position. And legitimate doesn't necessarily mean I agree with it or I endorse it. It just means, okay, that's a plausible case. And another piece of this, too, is to say, with a community, they're very, very good at knocking the edges off of bias. And in fact, our journalists who are just now in the process of learning to work with the community are often sort of a bit surprised and pleasantly so, usually, when a community member spots something and tweaks something, and they're like, and gives a reason, and they're like, yeah, actually, it's better this way. It is more neutral than what I had written. There was an implicit assumption in my mind, and so forth. So communities can keep you honest if you build a healthy community who are able to really interact in a healthy way. Obviously, that's the challenge.
Sure, and I thought that was an interesting point, and Brian mentioned that I don't like that when Facebook uses the word community because 2 billion people, like what's the limitation of the use of that word? But Wikipedia is primarily edited by a group of very hardcore enthusiasts, and there have been discussions about whether that creates a Western-centric bias or a male-centric bias and things which I'm sure you're used to discussing. But what do you envision the uptake of this? Like, do you see how many editors do you think? What size is the community of people who you think are going to be engaged in editing the news in this way?
I mean, I think it's too early to tell. I think there are aspects of helping out with journalism that are different from helping out with an encyclopedia. And so what does that exactly mean? How many people will be involved? Will there be more people involved in a lightweight way, or will there be more people involved in a very in-depth way? It's too early to know.
Let's talk about resilience and trust. Would you have published the Edward Snowden leaks?
Oh yeah, definitely.
And would you have published WikiLeaks? Let's say the Afghan war cables.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I would have to go back and look. I haven't actually reviewed.
So I guess the deeper question is like something like the New York Times is built for resilience. It's built to have a legal department which says that when they have allegations to make against Harvey Weinstein, for example, they are built as an organization to be able to do that. Wired is very lucky to be backed by Condé Nast, who backs us when we have stories like that where they're at risk. How do you build an organization that is resilient enough to speak truth to power using the crowd, and how do you ensure that those people?
So I mean, we are being very traditional. I mean, we have set up a relationship with lawyers to get stories legal as necessary and so forth. We're working with the community to talk about these kinds of things early on. I mean, a big piece of this is, at Wikipedia, the fundamental rule is you always need to have a reliable source. And that's particularly true. We have a very special policy around biographies of living people to say you can't write anything negative about them in Wikipedia without a really good, solid source. And that's been really important to ensuring the public trust in Wikipedia. So you don't think, I go on Wikipedia and they're just randomly slagging off someone they don't like. Because it always has to be sourced. It's not perfect, of course, but it's pretty good. And so we'll have the same kind of approach, to say, look, if we're going to, the whole purpose of the exercise is for things to be very thoroughly fact-checked, very carefully vetted. I would rather be slow and make sure that it's right.
Sure.
And I think the business model drives us in that direction, right? So if your business model is the pure advertising model, it's really important to be fast because that's how you go viral and get all the traffic. In our business model, it's really important to be right because if you blow a story, then all those people will say, well, why should I pay for this? It's not very good. And so you've got to be really, you got to try hard.
Let's talk about the role of some of the big platforms and the gateways to content. I think media organizations really struggle with their relationships with the like of Facebook and Google because they're basically controlling people's eyeballs in this new media environment. It's always interesting, we were talking backstage, it's interesting to see Facebook when they're talking to the American government about the Russian advertising during the election. The thing that Facebook can't say, so we know that 137 million or whatever people may have seen those ads. What Facebook can't say is that those ads may not have changed people's minds because it totally undermines their business model. They can't say, they may have seen them, but it didn't work, which...
Yeah. Ask any of our big corporate customers. Like the ROI is, no, they can't say that.
But I'm interested in this. I know you have some thoughts about the role of platforms in civic society and how they tweak the algorithm towards truth or not, and who makes those decisions. So when you're sitting down with Google and Facebook and things, what are the kind of recommendations that you're making to them?
Well, I mean, one of the things I think we should all step back and remember, when people are putting pressure on Facebook in particular, you should do something about this. In a slightly different set of historical circumstances, if Facebook started saying, we're going to start shaping the news agenda by deciding what we think is true or not, and algorithmically promoting or restricting things that we don't agree with, we would all be freaking out because that's kind of the dystopian fear about Facebook, that will end up with President Zuckerberg because suddenly everybody's gotten all these amazing, great news stories about. It wouldn't be a bad idea, by the way, if we're going to have a billionaire president, at least a sensible one. But no, I didn't actually say that. It would not be a good idea.
Headlines are being typed in the background.
No, Mark, don't do it. The world needs you to keep busy in what you're doing. So, no, but the point is, we should be cautious about saying, Facebook just should do something, right? I do think that for some of this, there are steps they can take. So one of the things that I would suggest to them, and I think they're experimenting with this kind of concept. So let's say I go to share something, and it's something that is known by Facebook because of fact-checking organizations like, Snopes or Politico, whoever it is, that this story has been debunked, that this is a hoax, this is a fake story. Then rather than not letting me share it or silently kind of suppressing the distribution, I'd like them to say, hey, by the way, you're about to share this with your friends. you might want to check out Snopes because it's been called a hoax, and you don't want to look like an idiot in front of your friends. And but if you want to share it, go ahead, share it, right? That we're not going to do anything after that. That's up to you to share it. And that would be, sort of a very narrow kind of thing they could do, is to give me better signals if I'm about to share something that is questionable. That's not trivial, right? Immediately that raises a lot of further questions. So, do we want them to say, oh, you're about to share something from the New York Times, but the president has said this is fake news, right? So be careful. No, we don't want that, right? So it's an editorial judgment.
I would love to see that come up in President Trump's Twitter feed as he's posting to Twitter. They're calling the New York Times failing, according to their latest business report.
So yeah, I'm very sympathetic to the plight that Facebook is in around these issues, simply because we don't want them to stop us from sharing whatever we want with our friends. You were saying they can't very well say, oh, but these ads didn't influence anybody. They also can't say, if you don't want fake news in your news feed, then you might want to rethink your idiot friends who share this crap. It's not really on brand for them to say that. But
when you're employing journalists for WikiTribune, you've got I think you said 10.
10-ish, yeah.
Is the current scale. A lot of news organizations in this country are known to be politically leaning in one direction or the other. Are you having to vet people for neutrality when you come into those conversations?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. So one of the things that we do struggle with a lot, because we're starting small and we're starting here in London, and we're hiring mostly young journalists. So, turns out young journalists in London share a certain world outlook in quite a number of ways. And I think that we need to really think a lot as we move forward about diversity and hiring practices and things like that. On the other hand, I also think that if you take seriously the ideas of trying to be neutral, you can get a long way. I always say, I've said for many, many, many years, that the very best Wikipedia editors on political topics, if you review all of their entire history of editing, for the very best of them, you couldn't possibly even guess what their personal politics are, because they do try really hard to be fair and neutral, and they're not pushing an agenda and so forth. And I do think great journalists ought to be able to do that, even if in journalism school they teach you it's not possible. I hope they're also teaching that you should try anyway, because I do think this, the idea that removing all bias and not being biased is impossible, I think it's true only if you've got perfection as your ideal. We're all human beings. We all have a limited knowledge. We will have biases that we don't even know about because it's never even occurred to us. It's sort of the old, if you ask a fish about water, they'll say, what water? It's the environment they live in. But people do understand, and if they make a really thoughtful go at saying, yeah, I realize I may have a certain perspective on the issue, but I need to present the other side fairly. I need to be thoughtful about bringing in quality sources that I don't agree with and so forth. It's worth it. It's really worth a go. And I do think there is a problem, in many ways, a business model problem around the advertising-only model. Particularly, there's some very detailed problems, so it's not just advertising only, it's also an environment where viral sharing is so important and so forth, that the brand value of different news outlets may have been reduced to some extent, because people start, for their news reading, they start from Facebook and what their friends are sharing, start from Twitter, start from Google News or somewhere like this, and they go eclectically to a lot of different sources, and they don't think, I'm a New York Times person, and that's what comes in the door every day, and I read the New York Times, and I love the New York Times. They just think, oh, here's content, which means for the New York Times, it's probably tempting to run a little bit more fluffy content that's cheap to write and goes viral if you can sell the same number of ads against it. I can't find it, which is very irritating for me as a Wikipedian, so this whole story is citation needed. But there was an quality online magazine maybe it's Atlantic Monthly, maybe it's Salon, maybe it was Wired. I don't know. I don't think it was Wired, but it's sort of a known and trusted magazine brand. And they did this piece, and they said, look, we had a senior journalist working for 3 weeks on an investigative journalism piece. We published it. We're really proud of it. It got a lot of traffic, a lot of traction, a lot of traffic. It was meaningful, and we're really proud of it. And the same day we published that, we had a millennial intern in the office write a listicle, sort of 10 somethings, right? And that went viral. It got roughly the same amount of traffic, same number of shares. We made just as much money off of that, but we basically paid a millennial intern, for an afternoon to write it, and we paid a senior journalist for 3 weeks. They're saying, look, we're going to continue to do the serious journalism because that's what we believe in, but basically we're putting our hand up and saying, hey, the business model is problematic for us, right? Sure. That every business metric is telling us, get rid of those senior journalists doing 3-week investigative stories and just churn out, spammy content, and that's a problem. And to their credit, serious outlets are resisting it. They are really serious about trying to find better business models, and I think people still believe in that brand value. That it's been harmed and it's under pressure, but. The New York Times isn't thinking, oh, fuck it, let's just become. I don't even like insulting BuzzFeed. So a few years ago I would have said, let's just become BuzzFeed. But the truth is, BuzzFeed has also gone in another direction. They still do very high quality, cat picture content and things like that. But they also do serious journalism. And so, all props to them. I'm sure that is. I've never actually spoken to anyone there. That's not It's not a purely economic business decision, although it may be a decision to say, actually, if everybody laughs about BuzzFeed being about cat pictures, maybe our long-term value is not there. So people do believe in this kind of long-term brand value. And now that we're moving into a slightly different era where we are beginning to see the recovery of revenue from readers, that's really exciting. So the New York Times has gone from 1 million to 1.8 million digital-only subscriptions in just about a year's time. That's huge. Thanks Donald Trump for selling so many newspapers subscriptions. But that's huge because that means that the New York Times will feel that much less pressure to just go down the clickbait avenue. That's great. Other things, until fairly recently, I left the board of The Guardian very amicably because I was going to do this journalism startup. And we have all seen at The Guardian, at the bottom of every story it says, please help us, please give us some money. I'm not responsible for that, but I'll take a little bit of the blame because when I was on the board, I said, just go for it, ask for money. We do it at Wikipedia. People don't mind, They were being very British about, is it okay to ask, And that's working for The Guardian. I think The Guardian, of course, quite famously has enormous financial problems, but that asking people for money is generating a meaningful amount of revenue. It's not going to be enough to close the full gap. Maybe it will be, but at least in the short term it's not. But it's meaningful, and I think that's really important, that if readers come to understand, whether there's a paywall or not, that actually contributing is worth doing, because otherwise you're just going to get, Upworthy content. There we go. I'll make fun of Upworthy.
I got time for one last question. Yeah. Which is, we talked a little bit about the role of some of the platforms in in this debate, because fundamentally you're right. The business model, everyone knows the business model for journalism online has been broken since probably the dawn of the internet. And I think that it's very frustrating to see Facebook and Google say, well, we're not a publishing company, we're not a media platform, we're something else entirely, we're this new category of thing, and yet they say, oh, you need to move on to Facebook instant articles, and by the way, we're going to take some of your advertising revenue for the Google does this with the AMP articles, and they give it preferential treatment, and for a long time were under a lot of pressure because they disincentivized paywalls, because they said that readers don't like it.
Yes.
And I'm putting a lot of companies under financial pressure. So they're clearly wielding this power. Do you think we are going to be in a future, and some other technologists have made this argument, that like banks having their investment and retail arms split up, we're going to need to see the separation of the business model from the content sharing platform for some of these big companies, Facebook and Google and the likes, so that they are no longer incentivized to put their own products first?
I don't know. I'm not particularly in favor of that. I think that interfering in the natural evolution of these things runs huge risks of governments getting it wrong and mucking things up in really bad ways, solidifying monopolies that are still vulnerable to disruption and so forth, making it hard for smaller players to get engaged and so forth. I had a whole rant at my lawyers about the data what's it called? It's the European data stuff. It's insane. It's completely insane. You can quote me on that. It's for small companies. It's like, wow, like this is like bonkers. I should just move back to the U.S. I'm not going to, but
I think the EU Competition Commissioner is about to come up on stage.
Oh, great. Yeah. Well, tell him that we're all leaving. So. See, I'm being outrageous for no reason. So I mean, I think there are difficult issues around that sort of thing, and certainly one of the issues that comes up quite a lot in discussions in Europe about things is really a failure to understand how deeply ingrained the First Amendment is in the U.S. and how a lot of the proposals and ideas just would not fly in the U.S. They're not even if Congress and the public supported it, the courts would overturn them because of a very long history of First Amendment jurisprudence. And so this idea that somehow we're going to force this kind of separation is such a murky area. It just seems very, very difficult to me and possibly premature. I think we're seeing the evolution of the business models. We're seeing, if Facebook were not at all concerned about terrorist content, if they took a real kind of, this is one of the problems Reddit got into, is that their early sort of founding philosophy was we're a wide open free speech zone. Much later they found out actually that's pretty horrifying, and they've started sort of shutting down certain subreddits that are on really nasty topics. And they had a lot of pushback from their community, even community who weren't interested in those nasty topics, but because it felt like a violation of that original premise. If Facebook were saying, hey, whatever, we don't care if people share things, if they're sharing something that's illegal, go and arrest them, it's not our problem, that would be bad. But they are saying, okay, right, this is not good for our brand, it's not good, we should think about how do we deal with this. But I mean, boy, it's a hard one. So.
Jimmy, that's all we've got time for. Thanks for coming, and I look forward to seeing Wired on your list of.
Oh right, I was going to talk about that because you did. I didn't necessarily like Peter put that list out, and I was like, I don't know, but we'll put it out and let the community work on this because I think basically what that was is not. It's like when can you link to something and just say like the president gave a speech on Tuesday. And you want to link and just Reuters says the president gave a speech on Tuesday without saying according to Reuters. Sure. Wired would be absolutely considered to be a reliable source, but we would always say according to Wired.
There you have it.
That's the difference.
Jimmy, thanks for joining us.
Yeah. Great.
Good luck.
Yes, fantastic.